So, lecture 13. Unlucky for some, lucky for all of you, as it's the last one. Hooray, I hear you cry. Political risk. It might surprise you to know that the previous 12 sessions have all really been about political risk in one shape or another. And so what I want to do is hopefully solidify some of the messages that we've had over the past 3 months. My gosh, sounds much longer 3 months somehow than 13 weeks. So, political risk, it's what we've been looking at, believe me, for the past few weeks. And the sections 2 and 3 here, we will be revisiting some of the material. Think of it as a revision session, if you like, for an exam you don't have to take. I could test you, I suppose. I could just throw out questions like who's this and who's that and what date and see what you've remembered. So what are we talking about when we talk about political risk? For example, what have we learnt? And then some parting thoughts. Introduction. I suppose the only introduction I'd like to make is just to have your eyes range over the region that we've been considering for the past 3 months. And when you see the place names in front of you now, hopefully they mean a little bit more, or your knowledge of them is a little deeper than it was perhaps on that last Monday in January when we started this journey. What are we talking about? It's a good question to ask, isn't it? A few sort of questions for consideration. This is very informal. I'm not going to make this a very difficult or tricky introduction to political risk, because I think the subject is a flexible one. It's a movable feast. It means different things to different organisations and individuals. But I will offer a definition of political risk, how it's measured, by whom, and finally, most importantly, perhaps, how accurate are these assessments. Again, the PowerPoint presentation has defeated Keynote. You're lucky, actually. The very final slide of the presentation, I was just going through it, and it disappeared. So I had to go online and find the same image, and I did it. So we'll see if I was fortunate or not, because it was a rather nice grand finale to the whole course, and there was the slide before me, blank. I thought, So, political risk. An attempt to assess, measure, and otherwise calculate the risk involved in working in a given setting. Now, when we think about political risk, it tends to be foreign countries, foreign settings. There's no reason why it should be, though. It can just as well work to the domestic setting. But typically, and certainly for us, we're thinking about what's it like to work in Egypt or Libya or Morocco or any other of these countries. What risks are involved? As I say, this is not a definitive definition. It's a useful one, and I think it covers most of the important elements. Some areas to consider for political risks. This is sort of covering ground we'll look at later insofar as who is it important to. But there are three broad elements to political risk. There is obviously the political side of things, political risks. So a change in government, whether through the natural process of an election or because of a coup or because of a revolution. This obviously has a great impact on anybody wishing to operate in country X or region Y. Violence is a major consideration. This is certainly true of our area of interest today. And by violence it might just be protests. If you work for a multinational and they're asking you, is it safe to invest in Egypt? And you say, oh, it's perfectly safe. And then the CEO goes home and switches on TV and there's protests. He or she might be a nervous individual who decides that, well, I don't like to see people marching in the streets. Now, they might have every right to be marching in the streets. There may be no bloodshed with that march, attached to that march. But it certainly puts people off. It can put people off, I should say. And obviously the violence is a scale for all violence, political violence and otherwise. And a revolution, the overthrow of a government, the turmoil that we're seeing across North Africa at the moment, is at the more extreme end of things. Finance. That's sort of related to politics, I suppose. I'm thinking here of changes in law. So if somebody said you can have a holiday home anywhere in the world, where would you want to buy it? And you might think, somewhere's a nice tropical beach. And then you think, oh, wait a minute, how stable is that country? How likely are the laws of that country to change? Is there going to be a threat to my life and my family's life when I go on holiday? So a lot of people felt perhaps very secure having properties in Cyprus latterly. I know a lot of Russians did. And then suddenly the Cypriot government needs to generate some cash, and a law is rushed into effect which can, let's say, help themselves to a portion of your savings in a Cypriot bank. This makes investors and shoppers nervous. It didn't actually impact on the Russians because there was an exemption there for them for some reason. So you can see new laws brought in suddenly make one a little nervous. So I, for example, would not buy a holiday home in Egypt for a variety of reasons. But one of those would be that I can't guarantee that what money I put in will be safe, that the law doesn't change again to say foreigners can't own property. So that's certainly a consideration for somebody going to business, not just holiday homes. Other factors to consider. If you're going to write notes, get tapping. There's a few of them here. Geopolitical location. This, of course, is central to what I'm thinking of all of these points through the lens of North Africa at the moment. North Africa is a great place to be because it's close to Europe. It has very good communications outside of the region. As we've seen in other lectures, communications within the region can be a little absent. No transcontinental railway. Transcontinental road system in North Africa is very poor. Some very good patches, but not joined up. No regional thinking. Topography and resources. Of course, if your country's got lots of oil and gas, it's going to encourage people to go and invest there. If, however, the oil and gas is under threat of attack, as has happened in Algeria of late, then people are less likely to go and invest there or send foreign workers there. You must also consider the people who live in the country and the neighbours. This would include such factors that we've considered as the youth population. So when you think about the inhabitants, it's not just does the government of Egypt like the government of America, it's what do the people on the ground think of you? What do they think of Coca-Cola? What do they think of McDonald's? Every time there's a protest, are you going to have your shop windows broken? Do you have sufficient insurance? Is it possible to get insurance for these things? That's important for a youth population as well, because it does tend to be younger people who are out breaking windows versus older people just tutting in front of the television set at the latest injustice to befall their country. Interests versus friends, an obvious one for any investor, company or government. And governance in the country of interest, good and bad. As we will see, and we have seen in the past, stability doesn't always equal good governance. In fact, in many of the countries of North Africa, it's quite the contrary. We've had so much stability for the past 50 years because we've had dictatorship. I don't think it's an either-or choice, obviously. You can look at other countries where they have very good governance and they're very stable. And every 4 or 5 years you have an election and one person goes in and one person goes out and it runs very smoothly. America's a prime example where the electoral system is in place. It might not be perfect, but it works. There's never any mass riots when a president is elected. The system works, as it does in much of Western Europe from time to time. How is it measured? I mean, this is obvious, I suppose. There's the big measure and the small measure, the macro and the micro. For all of those who've enjoyed your core economics classes, I'm sure you've done lots of macro versus microeconomics. The same is true of political risk. There are those things that will affect everybody in a country, like a revolution, for example. That level of instability will be across the board and affect every foreign investor and local business man or woman. The micro risks are affecting a certain industry. So at the moment in Algeria, people are running around and very concerned about protecting their interests in the petroleum industry. To be fair, there isn't much industry in Algeria outside of the petroleum industry, but it's not a place which has attracted tourism in the past 40 or so years. So that's an industry that doesn't need to worry about these certain sectors. In other countries of the region, the micro risk is often from a single corrupt official or minister. So if you're investing in hotels on the Red Sea, for example, Do you have to pay big bribes to the Minister of Tourism or his brother-in-law? These factors that might be affecting one industry when the Minister of Agriculture is a very open individual who won't take any bribes whatsoever. These are all factors which are very difficult to gauge from for oneself, and that's why we turn to providers of this political risk intelligence. That's the by who provides the information. There are dozens and dozens of companies that provide it. I'm just going to mention three this evening because they've been doing it for a long time. They have a good reputation with good reason, but by no means should you think that the information you get from any one of these is perfect. They're making calculations, they're gambling, essentially. And whilst you can put lots of chips down on the roulette table, unless you have a chip on each number, you can't cover all of the bases. So PRS Group. Country Data Subscriber Shortcut. They do country risks and also industry risks. You can see here the list of countries, of whom, 192 at the United Nations, and then variables. They have, I think it's 150 variables that you can input. So, it's a significant body of knowledge that they've been building up over the years. And then you go by year, by month, and then you have economic indicators here by country, and again, different variables. Budget expenses, budget revenues, capital investment, etc., etc. All of this, by the way, is available to you on the Johns Hopkins Library website, all of the PRS stuff. So if you want to get some good data on countries for any surveys you're doing, use these people or the next two that I'm going to mention. Eurasia Group, also very good. They have a lot more, I think they have more reports than perhaps the PRS Group, but I would use all three of the companies I'm going to mention rather than choose one or another. They call themselves the leading political risk research and consulting company, but then they would, wouldn't they? Their competitors say the same thing. And one of those competitors is, of course, The Economist, and The Economist Intelligence Unit in particular, EIU, company which seems to be trying to use up all the vowels. Anyway, it's the EIU. The Economist doesn't need much of an introduction, I suppose. They have the platform of a magazine which is most familiar, and lots of data in the back of that magazine every week. But the EIU website is truly impressive for the amount of material they have. Do be careful not to get bogged down in it, in any of these things. You really need to be very focused when you're doing research into a particular country. Otherwise, you find yourself looking at all sorts of budget figures from 2 decades ago to see, is it relevant today? Well, it may or may not be, but sadly, when you're making decisions, you don't generally have the luxury of 6-month research. Now, this isn't a company, obviously, but I wanted to bring up the Department of State because it's a very important... they're not a political risk company, but the product that they produce is very much related to political risk, and the same thing is true for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in Britain. It's not just travel advisory warnings, although they are important. Travel advisory warnings from both the State Department and the Foreign Office in London, I would argue, are generally over-cautious. But that's because governments have to worry about their citizens running into trouble, and I appreciate that. But don't read everything from State Department risk as gospel truth. They are trying to cover their backs and protect all of us. But again, an excellent source of information. Lots of people working on this as their full-time occupation. The question of accuracy. Well, there are two sides to this. One is data. Now, how accurate is the data coming out of our countries of interest in North Africa? That in and of itself is, I would say, tricky to gauge. But you can be pretty sure that most government figures are not 100% accurate. That would be my umbrella for it. If you read an unemployment figure, look for another source than the government of that country. A lot of the people we've looked at are relying on both government figures, so they're looking at what the Egyptian government put out, but they also have their other sources, of course, on the ground, one hopes. The other side of it, data, I said, yeah, they do the best job they can, but the other side of it is perception. Perception is something you can't really legislate for. It's all the non-data information that feeds into it. This is the stuff that involves people. And this is where, for my money, political risk will always fall down. And it's not a complaint against political risk. It's just a recognition that the human factor is central to any action or inaction in a country. And that's not something for which you can get data points. I mean, arguably, people will say, well, unemployment's gone up, or the cost of living has gone up and incomes have gone down. Okay, so does that mean that we could put those figures into a number crunching machine and we can say, next Wednesday about 3 p.m. there'll be a revolution? No, of course not, because they look like we can predict these things, but we sadly can't. So they produce these lovely maps which tell you areas that are not rated. Interestingly, Western Sahara is not rated. That doesn't mean they don't rate it. So, no, don't rate Western Sahara. It means there's no data, no credible data, or it's an area that we can't find. It's the only one I can see on the map, actually. There's North Korea. This is Lake Victoria, which isn't rated, but it's not quite the same thing. So very low, moderate, high, and the very dark colour is very high. So for The Economist, the only two places in the world today that are very high risk are Syria and Somalia. So when you're considering what to do in the summer vacation, cross those off your shortlist. It's questionable, how accurate these things are, but it's just to give generally people who are looking to invest, it's for business and government, a clue about a part of the world that they perhaps don't know very well. I used this earlier in the semester, but I rather like it, and I think it's. I'm just thinking now. I don't know if anybody else I've ever listened to connects Oscar Wilde with political risk, but I think this point is really valid. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. It's like I said, it's the people. It's those before you. It's all of these things which you cannot quantify. There is no data to explain how people are feeling necessarily, and certainly not to tell us how they will react and when. Collection of characters. I don't know if I've told you this before, but a good friend of mine was a former station chief in Tehran, and this is his comment on American policy in the Middle East. He said, we don't really have a Middle East policy, which is just as well, because if we did, it would be the wrong one. It's kind of funny, and I find it amusing, but I think his point was, it's so damn complex that it's impossible to have a policy for a region such as the Middle East, wherever we draw those borders. It's a constantly changing thing, and I think any policy which doesn't take into consideration changing circumstances is doomed to failure, and at least I hope that's what he meant. I must ask him again next time I see him. This is something else that's very important. I keep banging on about the human factor. I have done, I know, for 13 weeks, and the idea of change and human factor. But a lot of the data you're reading from The Economist, from PRS Group, from Eurasia Group, it is just that. It's political scientists and economists and other number crunchers giving you information. What you do with it is up to you. What they're not doing is collecting, let's say, anecdotes from people. They're not talking, they're not on the ground so much as they might be. And if they are on the ground, it's typically to meet with government officials and get the word from the top. This is not going to give you a complete picture. I think really the best way to understand any of the countries of interest is to go there, is to ideally to have the local languages and talk to people. I mean, that's not a terribly complex argument I'm making, but it's overlooked so often that it's worth remembering. So, for example, where are we talking about? What are we talking about? This is the bit where I'm going to now see how much of the past 12 weeks has stayed in your heads and how much of it has just floated away like gossamer. Who's this person? It's not fair, is it? This was week 1. This is January when there was snow outside, probably.
Philosopher.
Huh?
Heraclitus.
Very good. Excellent. Top of the class. Yes, very good. Heraclitus. Geography is fate. I did throw this up in week 1, but maybe you were still all becoming accustomed to my funny foreign accent and didn't really understand a single word I said in week 1, but I hope you understand me now. It's one of my favourite quotations when considering political risk. The weeping philosopher, as he was known. PowerPoint, damn you. Most of the states of the Middle East were created in the wake of World War I, but they had to wait for the passing of World War II before they got independence. Bear that in mind when you're thinking about what we've looked at. You're not going to write these figures down, you've already got them, I'm sure. Dates of these countries being occupied by foreigners and the number of years. It's important to remember what was there before, how long certain countries were occupied, or how briefly in the case of, pre-Libya and Morocco. It does very much inform how the people of the region still view us, foreigners. We are foreigners when we look at North Africa. It's important to remember that, and it's important also to remember what history we have, what relations we have had with the various countries of North Africa. And there are the flags. Shall I test you all? Yeah. Who knows them all? On a show of hands. Come on. Let's go through them.
Egypt. Libya.
New Libya and Old Libya, of course. It was the flag of King Idris.
Tunisia. Morocco.
Let's start over here then.
I think the other one was Yemen, wasn't it?
Wait.
No, that one.
No. Try and remember, this course...
Algeria is the one below Tunisia.
This course has been largely about North Africa, so we're looking at North African countries before people start
And
saying...
Niger is the one next to Mali.
Niger looks like the Indian flag somehow.
No, Niger, Mali.
Chad is above them.
Which one? This one?
That's
Chad.
Chad,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
And Algeria. Sudan is to the right.
Sudan?
Sudan.
And South Sudan.
No. South Sudan's a really complex flag. I left it off deliberately. That's for the country which doesn't yet exist in our region of interest. Western Sahara. Exactly, yeah. Nice colours. Anyway. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour through political risk as seen over the past 12 weeks. Egypt. When we think about political risk and investing or withdrawing investment, we think about certain things which from the outside look like a good thing and other things that look like a bad thing. And I'm just throwing up some of these examples to highlight that things don't necessarily play out the way you might think they will. So in Egypt, when we had this period of economic liberalisation in the early 1970s, it looked like a jolly good thing, because suddenly the country was opening up to foreign investment and foreign trade, etc., etc. And in 1974, the government launched this Infitah, or open door policy, to encourage people to come in. Of course, it led directly to the involvement of the IMF and the World Bank, who, when the Egyptian government then needed money to support this economic liberalisation, were told, you have to cut subsidies on bread and fuel. And the result was the riots that destroyed this beetle and other things more serious, like the deaths of lots of people. It would be a very brave analyst who, when you see the first signs of economic liberalisation in a country, says, 3 years from now there's going to be bread riots because the government are forced to cut subsidies following the demand of the IMF. But we've seen this example now. We saw it then in 1978 in Algeria, Tunisia as you were. We see it in the 90s in Algeria. So again, the data points help us to realise that on many, many occasions where the government is told, if you want this loan, you must withdraw subsidies, it's followed by a period of riot. This just has happened on so many occasions across North Africa that it would be worth bearing in mind if somebody asks you what's the right thing to do. Now, I'm not advocating that the governments keep subsidies in place forever and a day. As I mentioned, I think, at another time, the subsidies on bread in Egypt are so substantial that people will buy it to feed to their animals because it's cheaper than buying food stock. Clearly something is very wrong with the system. So perhaps we need to decide who is genuinely reliant on the subsidies, who are the poorest of the poor that will starve to death unless they get some assistance from the state, and who are the people that can afford to buy their own bread, and we can withdraw the subsidies perhaps from those people. It doesn't have to be subsidies, no subsidies. It seems like common sense. But time and time again we've seen it played out since independence in North Africa, that the common sense approach is one that hasn't been adopted. This is another very good sign for Egypt. 1977, when Sadat makes a visit to Israel, speaks at the Knesset, and we see him here shaking hands with Menachem Begin. Certainly through Western eyes, this was a very positive thing. It showed that a major, the most important in some ways, Arab country was normalizing relations with Israel, a normalization which took place the next year, 1978, with the Camp David Accords. Of course, it led to the assassination of Sadat. Again, in terms of political risk, you think, oh, Egypt's opening up, good relations with Israel, good thing. 4 years down the line, Sadat is assassinated, and the man on his right, Vice President Mubarak, becomes President Mubarak in 1981. Which leads to this great period of stability in Egypt. So an analyst of political risk would say, fantastic, we've got stability, that's lovely. We know where we are. If we invest in country X, and I'm not singling Egypt out for special attention here, if we invest in country X, we know that it's a stable government. In the case of some of our examples in North Africa, this means the strongman politics, the strong arm, the absence of any true democratic system, and also corruption, so that companies, American companies, as you know, are forbidden from paying bribes. It's illegal. So you might be surprised to read the front page of the New York Times today with its story about suitcases of money going directly to the president's office in Kabul. Suitcases, shopping bags, whatever. I mean, I don't know if it surprises you to know that bundles of money have been going to Afghanistan for the past decade that haven't all necessarily been accounted for. I'm sure they can account for it if pressed. But the question is, when you're investing in a country where you know there is bribery and corruption, you would probably be best to stay within the law and not invest there. Does that mean there are no American companies working in North Africa? Of course it doesn't. It just means that people have to find ways around this, or ways of operating fully within the law and dealing with the corruption of so many of those formerly stable countries in North Africa. It's complicated, isn't it? So, with his downfall, you have now an emerging democracy, and you have turmoil and insecurity. As a government, as an investor, as somebody interested in good governance, in human rights, all of these things are confusing. We are in a period of great uncertainty. But the choice has been made by the people of Egypt to go for a period of instability over the stability of a dictator. How it plays out is anyone's guess right now. Powerful friends are very important as well, and in consideration of political risk, it's another important question. We saw in the case of Libya, the Kingdom of Libya, the United Kingdom of Libya indeed, was very close with America and Britain. Both nations had air bases in that country, air bases which they were going to close in 1971, but which they shut a little earlier after Gaddafi's rise to power in 1969. You'd think that powerful friends, powerful allies would be a good thing in terms of political risk. It certainly encouraged American companies to invest in Libya. And here we have King Idris meeting with then Vice President Nixon. It turned out not to be such a good thing, because sometimes those powerful friends are the very people that your enemies are keen to get rid of. In this case, it was Gaddafi and the coup that he led with the Free Officers Movement. Successful, Well, that must be my mistake. That can't be PowerPoint changing an initial capital letter to lowercase. I can't blame that one on the machine. The coup, which was so successful because of the surprise, the timing, when the king was out of the country, and a general apathy among an electorate that hadn't yet got used to having democratic elections. Surprise is the big one in political risk as well. That's why any of the analysis you get, and if you're working for a company, you're paying a lot of money to buy this information, will always come with a rider on it that says, we're not offering any guarantees here. As well it might. In Tunisia, Congress of Berlin, you remember this? Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? What happened at the Congress of Berlin? 1878, a little bit earlier than the one you're thinking of. This is the one that sorted out the Balkans. This sorted out the Balkans, and interestingly, it was in the wake of a war with Russia and the Ottoman Empire. But it did lead to the division of Africa, the scramble, the Great Scramble, which of course, as you know, I argue, started many years before this with the French invasion of Tunisia in 1830. It doesn't matter how secure or stable your government is if there are external forces that are that much more powerful than you. In the case of this picture, it's a lot of Western European powers. And the Ottomans, indeed, they had a seat at the table. External actors. This was a nice one to remember. US and European support for an Islamist uprising. This is always a nice one to throw out. It gets people's attention. It was, of course, the uprising led by Abdul Qadir in Algeria. And the reason it was supported by parts of Europe and America is because they were having a dig at the French. It wasn't just to be chippy. There were sort of more nuanced geopolitical considerations than I've just offered you, but you get the picture. I can't resist put up this photograph of the pistols which Abraham Lincoln sent to Abdul Qadir to thank him for his work in defending Christians in Damascus in 1860, not for bashing the French. But anyway, powerful allies, foreign actors, worth remembering them all. Economics. It's about the economy, stupid. On independence, this is the situation we had. If you were drawing up a data set for any one of the countries in North Africa in the year they gained independence, you would not want to invest there. Most of your foreign labour, in the case of Algeria, 99-point-something% of your foreign expertise fled the country overnight, within a 2-month period. They took their money, they took their skills. And in the case of Algeria, the OAS burnt down all the factories too, so they were left with very little. Lack of skilled workforce and administrators. The countries were sent into turmoil, and limited industrial infrastructure was left in their wake. And today, what do we have? Well, it's not a great picture for the economy of North Africa, for various reasons, some of which we've got here just to remind ourselves. The bloated public sectors, an over-reliance on subsidies, so that it's 26%, I think we said, of Egyptian GDP goes on subsidies. Tremendous amount of spending on cheap fuel and flour. Limited economic diversity, particularly in Libya and Algeria, where 90% plus of all exports are petroleum-based or hydrocarbon industries. A crippling lack of regional and international integration. I said at the very beginning that North Africa is in a wonderful location, particularly for doing business with Europe, and it is. But it's not doing nearly enough business with Europe, and part of the problem is that, we mentioned it last week, all of these bilateral agreements which break things up. I think, in an ideal world, which of course this is not, a greater degree of regional integration would certainly help North Africa develop into a power bloc that could operate as maybe not an equal to the economic might of Europe, but certainly a much higher step up than they are doing today. And finally, the absence of serious economic planning. In the case of Egypt, it would seem, since independence, we could lose the word serious and just have the absence of planning. There seems to be very little evidence of planning at all. Oh yes, one of those lovely slides that shows different industry sectors. Libyan exports in 2010. 79% petroleum oils and crude, 11% petroleum gases, 8.1% petroleum oils refined, and then this is the diversity of the economy shoved into this margin, which looks like this sort of colour chart you get on your printer to make sure it's doing a good job. Yes, that really has to change. Politics. Remember all these smiling people. Well, at least most of them are smiling. Not easy to tell in every case if they're smiling or otherwise. Political risk. It's important to remember that politics is central to political risk, and in our region of interest there has been little, if any, genuine democracy. Equally, there's been no space allowed typically for opposition, whether it's organised political parties that have a chance of running an election or at the non-party level. Yes, political scene dominated by small elites often dominated by the military. Not in every case, but we've seen a very heavy military hand in most of North Africa since independence. And the military dominated by a desire for the status quo, of course. It's that question of stability again. And also don't forget that for certain investors, militaries are a very good customer. There's a couple of reasons for that. In North Africa, of course it varies from country to country, but there is often a great deal of cash made available for buying of weapons on an annual basis. This is good news for people who need to sell arms and other bits of equipment. It also reinforces stability in a country, which is good for investors. So it goes on. In the past 2-3 years, of course, we've seen a change to this paradigm, and the instability has impacted on everything from arms sales to oil exports. So where we end up, as I said earlier, nobody's quite sure yet. But again, the collection of data, the data points that political risk groups will feed you, do not take into consideration, again, the fact that most politics doesn't take place inside voting booths. I think in North Africa we're going to see a change, that increasingly the polling booths are going to become more important, though, not less. People are becoming increasingly interested in political parties. This is a change that is going to occur because of the revolutions, not in spite of them. Also, do remember this multiple identity thing that people have. That when we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, somebody is not just a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, they're also perhaps an unemployed member of the Muslim Brotherhood, or a student member, or an old member. They might be a brain surgeon, an unemployed brain surgeon, whatever. People have multiple identities and multiple interests. These will keep moving throughout their lives. Things don't stay the same, not even for a second. And it's not possible to have too much equality. Whatever it looks like from the outside, 2 years plus since the start of the so-called Arab Spring, I still argue that in most cases people came out on the streets because of a desire for equality, for dignity, for an opportunity. These seem like quite amorphous ideas, difficult to pin down or shape, and that's perhaps where some of the opposition groups are failing now and losing political power, because it's difficult to unify around an idea. And the idea of equality, of rights, of dignity, it's a difficult one to get people to rally behind after the initial excitement of removing your dictator. Security is central to political risk. I mean, that's why the industry exists, and that's why it's so very busy at the moment. People want to know, am I secure? Are my workers secure? Is my investment secure? Is the foreign government secure? These are all forms of security. It's not just physical security. But it is, like all of these things, involving people, a complex issue, which again cannot be pinned down to mere data. There is a degree of uncertainty in the world and a degree of insecurity in North Africa that may be on the rise at the moment, but it will be falling again at some future point. Now, what you need to know is, when's it going up and when's it going to come down? How quickly? How far? These questions aren't always obvious. I think the attack on the French embassy in Tripoli is an interesting point. It's the first attack on a major foreign installation in Tripoli since the fall of Gaddafi. I don't think the French were terribly surprised. They may have been surprised by the timing, but they had been promised an attack by some terrorist group because of their intervention in Mali. Now that the French have been so successful on the ground at pushing people out of northern Mali, where have they gone? Well, it would appear very clearly that some of them have gone to Tripoli. So again, you solve one problem, rather like pushing on a balloon, it's going to pop up somewhere else. And right now it's certainly, I think, gravitating north out of Mali, through Niger and into Libya. You don't need to think of these. Just bear in mind the terrorist attacks and other attacks that have taken place in North Africa, and this, of course, is a selection. It's not a comprehensive list, sadly. Were that it were a comprehensive list, and there were only 7 attacks in the past 30 years. Different attacks, different people, different targets, different objectives. When you consider terrorist groups in North Africa, please remember that they have different histories, they have different organizational structures, they have different leaderships, different individuals running those organizations, and their goals, aims and ambitions also change over time. Whether it's political assassination, attacks on oil and gas infrastructure, or targeting of major civilian populations, you have to be aware of the differences between the groups. This one obviously is a huge one related to security, food and water. Something which is often overlooked in political risk, because I suppose foreign companies tend not to invest much infrastructure in food and water resources overseas. It's not one of the biggest money makers, it's not the most obvious area in which to invest, so people overlook it. But if you bear in mind that we have this massively growing population, in fact in each of the countries of interest that we've looked at, the population since independence in every case has trebled. It's increased 3-fold since independence. That's a major factor in any consideration of political risk, and certainly how much food there is. What have we learned? Answers on a postcard, please. 12 words or less. I do like this quotation from one George Kimball. The darkest thing about Africa has always been our ignorance of it. I think that's a fitting idea, which I hope we have done something to dispel in the past 12 weeks, 13 weeks. I hope that the darkness has lifted slightly. My own ignorance of Africa, continental Africa, has, I would argue, been dispelled far more by talking to people on the ground than it has by the months of my life, which I've spent very happily in libraries. I mean, both are important, and I've had great fun reading and researching and doing all that stuff and writing papers. But I would say without hesitation that what I know, the important stuff that I know, has come from years of talking to people on the ground. And I would urge any one of you who's serious about a career or just serious about travel, serious about getting to know the issues that really matter, travel as widely as possible and ideally live among some of the people of the region. These people were telling me about how much they hated Gaddafi a couple of years before he was gone. Some parting shots, as we're talking about revolutions and insecurity in North Africa. If you remember just 3 things, it's not your PIN code to the ATM, although that's important. I mean, 3 things from this course. Now, these slides might be a bit mixed up because of this machine. As Annie will attest, when I came in, I was sort of spitting fire. this thing, just changed them again, from the journey from my office. 3 things to remember then. The overall message when we think back over this course. History matters. It matters enormously. I know you all know this, but it's worth having it down in black and white in front of you. Whether it's the French landing in Algiers in 1830, whether it's that colonial history with the different Europeans involved, the French, the Italians, the British, the Spanish. Just look at Spanish Sahara, a situation which is far from settled today, thanks to very recent history. I've seen some excellent papers. Omar Mukhtar and King Idris. These people are not forgotten. They're not forgotten by the people of the region, even if we were wholly ignorant of them before we started, if I dare say so, this course. You've got to know the history of the countries in which you're involved if you want any understanding of what people really feel, their alliances. Never underestimate the human factor. This is a huge one. And I had some really nice photographs here, which PowerPoint disappeared. So I just had to retype this. And as I retyped it, it appeared in a black box for some reason. It looks rather funereal, like it's a death announcement. It's not meant to. Human factor can be a very positive thing, of course, not just a negative black box thing. And finally, I would say, remember that change is permanent. That's a very, very important lesson to take away. Not just in terms of political risk, because obviously situations change, but very often, for decades, I've heard people talk to me in the Middle East and outside of the Middle East that things will never change here. It's always going to be this way. These people never learn. You hear many such ignorant comments. Well, change is permanent. The situation is never the same on the ground. And sadly, human folly is likewise a permanent condition. I think that's one to remember. And finally, I'm going to close with a cartoon from the New Yorker, which I don't know if you can see it, but it's a wonderful summation of political risk and the whole course. There's these people in Washington, D.C., I suppose, and the report has been written, and the final line is the chap saying, "Let's change brink of chaos to everything is wonderful." I would say, while it's a nice idea to change your report or your findings so simply, I don't believe that North Africa is currently on the brink of chaos. Sure, it's a time of turmoil, nor would I say that everything is wonderful. If I have to give an answer, then it would be a yes and no to the situation in the region. And I hope that some of those lessons you can take with you from this place into your lives ahead of you. And so we say farewell. Thank you.